Bom, pessoal, bom dia. Vamos se acomodando para retornar aqui com a segunda sessão de Economia Verde e Transição Energética. Então, bom dia, meu nome é Jay Van Amistel, eu sou especialista em sistemas alimentares e bioeconomia do Programa das Nações Unidas para o Meio Ambiente, a ONU Meio Ambiente, e vou estar aqui moderando essa sessão de Economia Verde e Transição Energética, né? Então, meu bom dia aí a todas e todos. A mesa aqui já está formada, eu agradeço pela agilidade aqui dos integrantes, que já sentaram aqui para a gente poder agilizar, visto que a agenda está um pouquinho atrasada, né? Mas eu não deixaria de apresentá-los, né? Então, a gente tem a professora Cynthia Sanborn, né, diretora do Centro de Estudos sobre China e Ásia, da Universidade do Pacífico, do Peru. A colega Sheng Chunhong, espero estar pronunciando adequadamente, ela é professora assistente na Universidade de Estudos Internacionais de Xangai. O André, está ali, né? O André Lucena, professor aqui da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Luiz Silva, não está aqui? Luiz, está por aí? Então, venha, Luiz, sente-se com a gente, por favor. Luiz Silva. E Luiz Silva, da RUC, eu vou pedir depois para ele traduzir aqui para a gente essa sigla, mas é um pesquisador assistente. Dong Jianyun, está aqui conosco, professor na Nanjing, a Universidade de Silvicultura da China. E Lucas Figueroa, agora sim, da Universidade Nacional de San Martín, Argentina. Então, pessoal, só para trazer aqui 2 ou 3 palavrinhas de início, né? Agregando à mesa anterior, o Rio de Janeiro é muito simbólico dessa ligação com a China, porque pela primeira vez essa ligação ocorreu aqui na história, né, vamos dizer assim, do Brasil, na vinda de Dom João VI, rei de Portugal, no século XIX, fugindo de Napoleão, ele vem ao Brasil e resolve iniciar, de fato, o Brasil como o centro, e uma das primeiras medidas dele é trazer uma colônia de pioneiros da China, uma colônia de pessoas que saberiam como cultivar, né, o chá preto. Essa história está marcada e registrada no nosso jardim botânico aqui da cidade. Existe um monumento chamado Vista Chinesa, em homenagem a essa colônia. Então, data aí do século XIX, início do século XIX, essa relação. E hoje é muito interessante estarmos aqui sendo provocados a pensar o Brasil também enquanto uma civilização, a tal qual a China o faz, né? Conversava isso aqui com o Raoni. E essa discussão para a gente ficou parada, né, lá na década de 50. Né? Então, aqui, essa mesa, a gente vai tentar avançar aqui nesse tema da economia, economia verde. Eu acho que hoje a gente tem uma sopa de letras, né? Economia verde, economia circular, economia ambiental, economia ecológica. Né? Acho que temos muitos registros, né, para pensar essa díade, né, meio ambiente e economia. Tem tudo a ver com o que a mesa anterior também tratava sobre desenvolvimento sustentável, seus reflexos na transição energética, e eu vejo também que a gente vai começar a trabalhar também alguns tópicos florestais, né, que é tão importante. Acho que a China, para a gente, é um exemplo, esse projeto de restauração que ocorre na China desde a década de 70, que restaurou basicamente o tamanho do passivo que hoje a gente tem no Brasil também em relação às áreas que precisam ser restauradas, né? Então, temos aí muito que aprender. Vou passar primeiramente, então, para a professora Cíntia Sabon, né, do Centro de Estudos China e Ásia-Pacífico, da Universidade do Pacífico do Peru.
Muchísimas gracias. Es un gran honor estar aquí con todos ustedes. I am going to speak in English. I could do English or Spanish, but not Portuñol. But it's just a real pleasure to be here learning from all of you today. Today we find ourselves in a world where nationalism and protectionism are on the rise and where powerful states are competing for access to scarce resources rather than cooperate on shared problems. And as we've heard today, among the most important challenges that absolutely demand global cooperation is the fight against climate change that affects all of us. The impacts of rising temperatures, we've heard this morning amply, are already being felt around the world. This is the agenda of what I'm going to speak on. Whoops. Let's see. How do I do this? Nope, it's stuck. Okay, next one. Okay, this is the agenda I'm going to speak to. But as we've heard this morning already, I don't need to go over it, the challenges of rising temperatures absolutely demand that we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and that we replace fossil fuels with more renewable energy sources if we're going to save this planet for future generations. This means developing supply chains that we are all a part of, but in very different ways. And this is what I'm going to speak about this morning, the role of Latin America, particularly South America, and China within this global energy transition process and within its key supply chains. Today, our region, Latin America, faces a second opportunity in this century to capitalize on global demand for our basic commodities. The first, which we often called the China boom, took place largely between 2003 and 2014 when we supplied minerals, fuels, soybeans, beef to China's growing and industrializing economy. And our economies also grew considerably. Now we have the global renewable and low energy carbon chain, which is heavily dominated again by Chinese companies and investors, and we are again facing growing demand for our copper, our lithium, our iron, and many rare earths and other minerals that are critical for the production of solar and wind power generators, for electric vehicles, for digital technologies, and of course for the defense industry as well. Today, China is the dominant actor in the refining of these critical minerals and controls upstream and downstream processes for the production of magnets as well. But these are minerals that we in South America have in abundance. Latin America holds more than half of the world's lithium reserves, and Chile and Argentina are among the world's leading producers. Chile and Peru are the world's two top producers of copper, and Peru is the second largest producer of zinc after China. Brazil, as you know better than I do, has enormous reserves of niobium, graphite, nickel, lithium, and rare earth minerals. However, mineral extraction has not been a reliable basis for sustained growth and equitable development in our region in the past. And commodity booms have tended to weaken the capacity of our states and reduce economic diversification efforts and accentuate the social and environmental risks that are endemic to extractive models of development. So the important question is how we can be different this time around. If we can strike a better balance between our dependence on mineral exports for many of our economies, the desire to move up the value chain, and the imperative to seek better social and environmental governance along the way. These are all components of what we consider a just energy transition, which includes upstream, midstream, and downstream activities. And related to this question is what role can and will China play in these efforts? These questions drive a major research project that I have the honor of leading from our center. It's a collaboration with the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, Peking University's program on public financing for development, and colleagues in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. So first I want to talk about what lessons we may have learned from the recent past, from the China boom, the ones we don't want to repeat, right? As a recent report prepared for the China CELAC Forum reminds us, Latin America continues to be the most unequal region in the world, with little capacity for sustained growth as it is, and weak public institutions. We have deeply patrimonial social structures and large indigenous and low-income populations whose territories often overlap with those that are rich in mineral resources. In 2008, the first white paper was produced outlining Beijing's vision for engagement with the region, while its companies were still learning to navigate the political and institutional environment of our different countries. With China growing at a rapid pace, our elites actively sought new business opportunities to access that huge market, and also to attract Chinese direct investment, offering a diversity of options and conditions for doing so. So what were the results of the first China boom earlier this century? On one hand, there was a considerable diversity of situations. It became clear there was no Chinese way of doing business with Latin America, and no single or unified Latin American way of doing business with China. Some countries, such as Peru and Chile, took better advantage of the growing engagement with China as part of their broader orientation toward trade liberalization, bringing positive trade balances and economic growth. Other countries did not fare as well. Venezuela and Ecuador, for example, where their state-owned enterprises accumulated huge debts through agreements that committed them to oil extraction and production well into the future. Also, in this, what we call the race for resources the last time around, exacerbated most of our country's dependency on primary commodity exports and on the continued use of fossil fuels. And while the Chinese companies that came to Latin America were very diverse in terms of their ownership structures and history, they faced some common challenges, interacting with local communities and addressing environmental concerns. This situation accentuated challenges that are inherent to the extractive industries, such as disputes over land and water rights, levels of monetary compensation for populations that are displaced, and actual or potential environmental impacts. In some cases, social tensions prevented the full development of projects, and in other cases led to delays and violent state responses. So in short, I want to emphasize, while China was one of the main drivers of our last economic boom, it was not actively involved in the sustainable development of our region. And while China is not directly or exclusively responsible for the problems facing its companies, both the Chinese government and host countries must learn today from this recent experience. And that's where our project is going. The question is, how much has changed this time? There we go. Okay, on one hand, China's centrality in this period has increased, as has its public commitment to development cooperation and energy transition, as we've heard. Although there is greater competition for a wider array of mineral resources now associated to energy transition, China's role in global supply chains is indisputable, as it has a decade or more of time ahead of the rest of the powers. In 2016, Beijing produced a second white paper outlining China's policies for Latin America. And from there, its officially declared cooperation focuses on at least 6 priority areas, including energy, natural resources, infrastructure, industry, and scientific and technological innovation. Furthermore, China's importance to Latin America in general has increased in terms of volume and variety of trade and investment. China is Latin America's largest trading partner by far in critical minerals, and accounting for over half of our total mineral exports. Chinese foreign direct investment in our mining and energy sectors has also increased considerably. And as just a few examples I'll skip over in the interest of time, Chinese investment in Peru is heavily concentrated in mining, although we've documented 154 Chinese companies across a dozen sectors. The largest investments remain in mining, particularly copper and iron. And in Brazil, I think you know better than I do, Chinese investment is also very concentrated in such sectors. The government of China today also proudly declares a leading role among the community of states, as we heard in the previous panel. Last April, when addressing the leaders' meeting on climate and just transition, President Xi Jinping urged all countries to prioritize low-carbon development, and also stating we must accelerate a just transition. And I quote, "Green transformation should be people-centered and pursued in a way that promotes people's well-being and climate governance together." But if China's prominence has increased in our region, Latin Americans' expectations from China have also increased. We seek to exert greater control over our natural resources, increase tax revenues generated by their extraction. We also want to negotiate technology transfer to develop our own clean energy and to undertake value-added economic activities related to new renewable energy value chains. Organized civil society in Latin America today is also more articulate, with demands to respect indigenous rights, labor protections, and community participation. This requires us to apply the best environmental and social safeguards on these investments. So in this new context, what are Chinese investors, banks, and companies doing about it in this region? Well, this is sort of a mapping that we did of where Chinese investments and companies are in the value chain of the 4 countries we're focusing on in this project: Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. In these 4 countries, Chinese companies, often the very same ones, are deeply involved in all steps of the energy transition value chain, to energy production, extraction, processing, production, and distribution, the construction, operation of hydroelectric power plants, wind, and solar farms. The only area where they are not present, as we can see, at least in these cases, is manufacturing of equipment. However, in these countries, Chinese investment is still more prevalent in the extraction of raw materials. In Chile and Argentina, Chinese companies are most involved in lithium. In Peru, and most recently in Colombia, in copper, iron, and also gold. This difference in our resource endowments also affects the type of Chinese investments and companies that are present. More Chinese private companies are involved in lithium, where a large handful of state-owned enterprises in the traditional minerals, such as Chinalco, Minmetals, Shogang, and Zijin. As far as value-added industrial activities go, there's some very promising experiences. There's another mapping we have of Chinese power development and operation in the region. Value-added initiatives are also, there's some promising initiatives in Argentina. China's greenfield investments in battery factories and equipment, as well as lithium extraction, have been announced. In Brazil, I'm sure you know better than we do, there's been some considerable expectation from Chinese investment in factories for the production of electric vehicles and batteries, as well as support for research and development projects. This is all very promising, but there's also still much to be done for these initiatives to take place, to be profitable, and above all, to be coordinated across our region. And some of them, in fact, are on hold due to global and local uncertainty. We need to move further in that direction. What about Latin America's own energy transitions? Are we moving in that direction that we need to, as we've heard in the morning? Well, in this area, there's also progress, but much remains to be done. Coal, oil, and natural gas account for about 77% of total energy supply in Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Argentina. And most states in this region continue to heavily subsidize fossil fuels. Brazil stands out in this region as a leader in renewable energy. Brazil generates over 80% of its power from renewables. We are all very impressed and paying attention to that. Yet even in Brazil, I understand they continue to rely on oil for transportation and for important export revenues. And despite commitment to global energy transition, to date, Chinese energy investment in Latin America also remains, first and foremost, in oil extraction. Indeed, in recent years, Chinese oil companies have been stepping up investment in the region, particularly Brazil, Suriname, and Guyana. The next largest amount of Chinese energy investment in this region is hydropower. Huge hydroelectric power plants in the hands of giant Chinese state-owned enterprises, such as CTG, Power China, and Sinopec, dominate Chinese energy shares in Argentina, Colombia, and Peru, as well as Brazil. Although this form of energy is considered renewable, its continued expansion across our region is constrained a bit by geography, by climate change-related drought, and by the environmental sensitivity of such operations. But these challenges aside, the reality today is that Chinese companies are new players in the region's electricity sector. In our study, we identified 80 energy projects with Chinese investment, 10 hydroelectric plants in Peru, 14 electric projects in Chile, 8 electricity projects in Argentina. And in Chile and Peru, it should be emphasized that Chinese companies have acquired assets, in particular in electricity generation and provision, that were left behind by Western firms abandoning the South American market. So does this investment facilitate a just energy transition in Latin America? The truth is not yet, for several reasons. First, there's persistent challenges to adequate environmental and social regulations of these activities, both involving extraction of critical minerals as well as the rest of the energy chain. On the part of our governments, we have legally recognized the right to consultation for indigenous communities and to citizen participation in all levels of the development of mining, hydro, and energy investment. Our standards in environmental and social governance on the books are among the highest in the world. Yet our research shows that to a greater or lesser extent, we still have relatively weak governance capacity of territories, problems with transparency and government decision-making, and fragmented implementation of our regulatory frameworks. On the part of China, we also observe a growing emphasis on environmental and social governance among authorities, ministries, offices for the State Council. As my colleague, Dr. Kehan Wang, has shown in an ongoing study, there are more than a dozen rules and guiding principles that potentially involve Chinese companies abroad, and a recent tendency to introduce mandatory rather than just voluntary guidelines for the behavior of Chinese overseas investment. There are also initiatives from Chinese business associations and guilds themselves, such as the CCCMC, which offers support to its members to carry out due diligence on their investments. However, there's one thing that we need to stress, which is governments on both sides are not fully exploring ways in which Chinese investment can promote clean energy alternatives for communities most in need. And I'll just stress this slide, because as we know, in addition to the need to transit to clean energy, we also need to provide access to energy for still large numbers of Latin Americans that do not have it. We did some research, and I'll just summarize here, on the potential and challenges for region-wide initiatives crossing borders in Latin America, and we mapped quite a few, many of which are still on paper, they're best wishes, but some of them which have tremendous opportunity to be scaled up. But we need support, we need investment, because no country can do this alone. We need support among Latin American states, and also from important investors like China interested in this sector. So I'll just end here. Our project is very much a work in progress. We are producing a series of papers and policy documents this year. And we feel like our role as universities, they're all university-based researchers involved, is to generate public knowledge for better decisions. We have a series of publications in progress and recommendations. If you give me 30 seconds, I will finish the recommendations, because demand for critical minerals is only going to increase in the coming years. The task of establishing sustainable and inclusive production methods along the value chain is fundamental for countries of origin like ours. When we talk about a just energy transition, we also talk about people having control over their own territories and access to energy for communities and households. For Latin American regional organizations such as CELAC, ECLA, CAF, and BEAD, we're talking about vision and leadership. For China, we're pleased to learn that multiple government departments in China have guidelines for their companies overseas. We encourage more emphasis on implementation of these and providing more opportunities for us to move up the value chain. And finally, for Brazil, the Paris Agreement focused rightly on decarbonization. The COP30, held this November, must tackle the material conditions under which decarbonization takes place. Although this was not initially part of our project, we hope to collaborate more with our Brazilian colleagues. We hope that Brazil continues to exercise its green diplomacy. It's a host of this and other important fora, promoting guidelines for responsible mineral sourcing and extraction within the climate governance framework. Thank you very much.
Bom, dando sequência aqui à nossa programação, convidar a Shen Xuanhong, da Universidade de Estudos Internacionais de Xangai.
大家好，我是来自上海外国语大学国际关系与公共事务学院的盛春红。这一次呢，是我人生中的最长的一次旅行，跨越山海，来到了我在本科学习的时候就知道的重要的这个环境领域的城市里约。在我读本科的时候呢，我学习的专业是国际政治。国际政治呢，那个时候我们经常说研究的话题都是高级政治、战争、冲突。但在本科的时候，我就知道了这个里约的这个条约，还有里约的这个精神。在本科的时候，我就决定了，我未来要研究的领域是环境，我要研究的并不是人与人、国家与国家的战争和冲突。我更加感兴趣的是人与人之间、国家与国家之间怎么去解决一些共同的难题。其实今天很多的学者都已经谈到了这个话题，就是气候变化。我的研究领域呢也是气候变化。好，在这儿呢，其实大家也提到了另外一个在我们这个环境领域都非常关心的概念，那就是可持续发展。但是呢，我今天呢想在继承前人的这个前人的智慧和成果的基础之上我想提出自己的一点有批判性的一些看法。我觉得可持续发展的这个概念还是过于人类中心主义了。我今天想提出一个绿色发展的概念。我认为绿色发展的概念是什么呢？它既满足人类的需求，也满足自然的需求。它的最终的 追求的目标是人与自然和谐的发展的一种经济发展的模式。当然，我们有的时候也会想，在我们人类存在之前，地球和自然都已经存在了。也像前面的老师们提到了，教授们也提到了，就像人类就像恐龙一样，也许人类灭绝了，我们这个地球仍然存在。但是我想说，在当下的这个世界，我们人类的活动对自然环境产生了巨大的影响。而在这样的情况下呢，我们其实不能只是满足人类的需求，我们需要看到其他的物种也是需要我们人类的这个就是自然的一种需求，比如说对生态环境的修复，比如说这个生物多样性保护当中，我们对很多动物和植物的家园的保护等等，在我看来，这个都是自然的一种需求。在这种情况下呢，其实这样的一个发展形式或者发展的理念呢，对我们当下的以人类为中心的，或者说以理性的人类为中心的这样一种自由经济发展模式呢，我认为它是非常不一样的。接下来呢，其实我想用中国的绿色发展的道路来给大家解释一下。那这样的一种绿色发展，它有什么特殊之处？中国在可持续发展，或者说在特别是大家反复提到的，在这个能源转型的过程当中取得的那些成就背后的缘由是什么？我今天想跟大家分享的就是，中国绿色发展道路背后是一个强大的政府加一个强大的企业，是他们的通力合作才形成了今天这样的一个局面。那在这种情况下呢，我就想从供给和需求两个方面来展开对中国绿色发展经济的模式的一个理念的分析框架。首先是政府，它需要树立一个绿色的愿景。其实前面很多专家和教授提到了我们中国的经济发展模式是什么？我们树立一个目标，而且是有长远的规划的。也就是说，用可持续发展概念当中，我们的这个发展的很多的规划或者说战略，它不仅仅是考虑当代人的需求，也考虑未来我们子孙后代的需求，同时我们还考虑自然生态环境的需求。那在这样一个需求出发的导向的经济体制下呢，它就会什么？它就会激发我们市场的一个绿色的供给绿色的供给。接下来我想说的是，刚才也有人提到了，就是说，其实在国际谈判的过程当中我们反复提到，我们每个国家到底有多少的真金白银投入到我们这个可持续发展的过程当中，或者说绿色发展的过程当中。那在这个过程，在这个模式之下中国的绿色发展有一个非常显著的特点，那就是什么？政府的绿色投资优先然后呢，在政府的大量的绿色投资的情况之下其实中国的这个绿色低碳的制造业呢，就得到了一个大规模的发展。我们也都清楚，其实在这个创新性的绿色低碳发展这个产品的初期，它会面临很多的挑战。首先是就它很难获得消费者的认可，它也很难有一个比较大的市场。但是政府的一些绿色投资它其实就创造了一个这样的绿色低碳的市场，进而在一个大规模的市场的前提之下很多的企业呢就在技术方面呢采取了很多的这个我们说的投资，促进了技术的进步。其实在我2010年在德国柏林自由读博士的时候光伏、风电、电动汽车，他们的成本都是非常高的。但是当我读完博士回到中国的时候，今天的中国或者说今天的世界已经看到，我们的光伏、风电还有电动汽车，它不是只是一个政府补贴的产品，它们是非常有市场竞争力的产品。这背后其实就是政府先行投资以及企业家促进技术进步共同的作用。在这儿呢，我还想提出中国政府的一个模式，那就是服务型的政府。也就是说，在这个绿色发展的过程当中，政府它发挥了怎样的作用，企业它又发挥了怎样的作用？从我的一些实地调研和访谈的情况来看其实很多人可能会提到中国的国有企业和民营企业在能源领域的这个竞争，但是从实地调研的情况来看呢， 反而他们并非只是竞争的关系，他们有很强的合作的关系。政府还有我们的中国的能源相关的国有企业，他们在绿色发展过程当中提供的是服务，比如说大型的基础设施，以及很多能源相关的项目的一个维护、维修等一些非常复杂的公共事务。这个其实中国的各级政府和国有企业呢，它都是在里面发挥了非常重要的作用。我后面呢会用一些例子来进行解读。那民营企业在这个过程当中，他们发挥了怎样的作用呢？那么他们就是提供绿色低碳的产品，而这些绿色低碳的产品是非常有竞争力的，就是在市场方面，他们不断的创新，降低了这些产品的这个成本。好，接下来我想用一些数据来给大家展示一下，就政府的作为一个我们说这个集体的意愿的 collective 这个或者说公共福利的一个代表，它进行常年的坚持进行可再生能源的投资是非常重要的啊，政府的投资，这呢只是一个1年的数据，我相信研究这个可再生能源领域的是非常清楚的，中国在可再生能源领域的投资是长达几十年，一直处于世界的前列，一直是世界的第一。这张图大家就可以看出来，中国的可再生能源的投资的这个量是远远超过其他很多的国家。我经常跟学生讲，我们中国并不是最发达的国家，我们甚至还是一个发展中的国家，但是我们的政府在可再生能源领域的投资是非常的高的啊，非常的高的，这也是非常难得的。这个呢是全球这个可再生能源研究机构的一个数据。除了我们说这个投资导向之外呢，其实中国在这个产业链的下游，就是可再生能源产品，我们说的可再生能源的装机容量的增速呢，也是非常的显著。这个图呢也给大家展示了，就是我们的量是非常的大的。另外一个数据，我想跟大家分享的就是这些年中国在风电、光伏等可再生能源的领域的投资，已经远远超过了火力发电、煤电。好，这个是中国的，给大家展示一下中国的这个一些这个制造业非常强的，我想大家也是非常熟悉的，中国的光伏呀，中国的电动汽车呀，中国的风电呐，其实都是在各个领域都是遥遥领先的。另外，我想说的是，中国的可再生能源产品已经进入了千家万户，这个就是我的这个电动汽车，我想给大家展示一个数据，展示它的市场竞争力。那就是我开100公里，我只要花10度电，我只要花不到4元人民币的价格。你去看一看，为什么这么多中国人，为什么很多世界的年轻人喜欢买电动汽车，并不是它不是一个补贴的产品，而是它真正是有市场竞争力的产品。好，这个其实这个后面都是一些。另外，我想最后再补充一个，就是中国的可再生能源的发展呢，它也是非常注重社会的公平公正的，或者说公正的能源转型。也就是说，我们可再生能源的发展不能只是让富有的人享受其中的利益，而是要让普通的老百姓在其中也获得相应的收入。这个就给大家展示的这个光伏和渔业的结合。这个是光伏跟什么？跟这个荒漠化治理呀。跟牧民的结合，当然还有光伏跟农业的结合等等。鉴于时间有限，我最后想跟大家说的是，我们如果要一起很好的应对气候变化，我们需要真正的投入，我们需要真正的行动，而不是停留在无休止的争议当中。而在这个过程当中，我们是需要一个强大的政府，还有一个非常有竞争力的市场去共同完成的。在这个过程当中，我们也需要关注社会的需求。这个就是我的汇报，谢谢大家，谢谢。
Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Então, seguimos agora para a apresentação do professor Andrea Lucena, da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro.
Agradeço o convite de estar aqui com vocês, agradeço aos organizadores, aos colegas que vieram da China para participar desse evento conosco. Eu vou fazer uma apresentação que tem uma relação com o que foi apresentado mais cedo pelo professor Roberto, e, inclusive, foi combinado, tá? Essa apresentação, elas duas foram combinadas, a gente trabalha junto e resolvemos apresentar duas perspectivas diferentes a respeito do mesmo tipo de ferramenta de modelagem que é utilizado no nosso grupo de pesquisa, que, como o Roberto falou, são grupos de pesquisa que têm uma participação internacional bastante relevante, mas mais do que isso, eu queria tentar mostrar a importância desse tipo de ferramenta para a formulação de políticas nacionais. O Roberto falou muito sobre a importância de você ter esse modelo na discussão internacional, quando você tem países do norte global dominando discussões sobre potenciais trajetórias de descarbonização, potenciais trajetórias para se alcançar metas climáticas como 1,5 graus. Essas ferramentas, elas colocam o Brasil num poder, né, de ter propriedade para se colocar nas discussões de uma maneira embasada pela ciência. E não é diferente de maneira doméstica dentro do país. Então, um pouco do que eu vou falar é como a gente utilizou essas ferramentas de modelagem para ajudar a informar o governo brasileiro na formulação da sua estratégia climática. Eu vou falar rapidamente sobre as ferramentas, o meu tempo aqui é bastante curto, e eu vou ter até alguns slides repetidos com o Roberto, não quero perder tempo na parte técnica. Eu quero focar mais no fato de como esses modelos foram usados para informar a política pública. Especificamente, o Comitê Interministerial de Mudanças Climáticas nos convidou, né, sabendo dessa capacidade de modelagem que a gente tem, em função de projetos anteriores que tivemos com o governo, como o projeto Opções de Mitigação, que o próprio Raoni também já participou em parceria conosco. Em função dessa capacidade de modelagem, nós fomos convidados para ajudar a formular o que seria a próxima meta brasileira a ser colocada na UNFCCC, na Convenção do Clima, que foi divulgada no final do ano passado, a meta para 2035. O Roberto já falou, né, que os modelos integrados eles têm essa grande diferença de pegar todos os setores de maneira conjunta, né, e a grande diferença que você traz nesse resultado é que o ótimo setorial não necessariamente é o ótimo global, ou seja, eventualmente um setor específico pode estar olhando o que é melhor para si, mas o que é melhor para aquele setor não necessariamente é o melhor para o país como um todo ou para a economia como um todo. Então, o modelo tem essa vantagem de olhar tudo de maneira integrada, e eu acho que, no caso do Brasil, essa capacidade de modelagem integrada ela é bastante importante diante do perfil econômico e de emissões que o país tem. Então, nós temos um país onde grande parte das nossas emissões e grande parte da nossa economia está associada ao uso do solo, florestas, agricultura, pecuária. Então, um modelo que foca apenas em energia, como é a maior parte dos modelos que são encontrados mundo afora, eles perdem, por exemplo, a interação que eventualmente o setor de energia poderia ter com o uso do solo, perdem a capacidade de avaliar qual é o papel desses setores associados ao uso do solo no processo de descarbonização e alcance de metas nacionais. Então, a grande vantagem desse modelo é justamente ter a integração para poder gerar cenários de trajetórias de emissão futuras para poder alcançar uma determinada meta. Eu já vou falar já que meta é essa, tá? O Roberto apresentou esse slide. Esses aqui são os nossos modelos integrados e eu vou focar no resultado do modelo BLUS, que é o Brazilian Land Use and Energy Systems Model, que é um modelo de avaliação integrada com foco apenas no Brasil. Então, a gente tem modelos globais, como o Roberto apresentou, o COF, que fornecem condições de contorno para o país, como comércio de energia, bens e serviços, e o modelo BLUS ele tem maior capacidade de detalhar, né, os sistemas de uso do solo, de energia, enfim, de todos os setores que emitem gases de efeito estufa em última instância, como indústria, resíduos e etc., de maneira mais detalhada por ser um modelo de escopo nacional. Não vou entrar em detalhe na metodologia, eu queria já entrar, né, diante da dificuldade, do limite de tempo, já na aplicação do resultado. Basicamente, o que nos foi pedido foi encontrar um número para 2035. Tá? Aqui a gente tem, nessa figura, as emissões históricas brasileiras, que são as barras à esquerda, que chegou em 2020 a 1,79 gigatoneladas de CO2 equivalente, e o Brasil colocou no Acordo de Paris, e ao longo das revisões que foram feitas em seguida, a meta de 1,32 gigatoneladas em 2025, esse ano, e 1,2 gigatoneladas em 2030. E também na COP26, perdão, em 2021, foi colocada a meta pelo governo brasileiro de se alcançar emissões líquidas nulas de gases de efeito estufa em 2050. Então, nosso exercício de modelagem basicamente consiste em encontrar os pontos ao longo dessa trajetória para poder servir de meta brasileira no acordo, na revisão do Acordo de Paris, nas novas NDCs na Convenção do Clima. Só um parênteses a respeito do perfil de emissões brasileiras e quanto essas metas, de fato, elas são ambiciosas. Como o Roberto falou, a meta de alcançar neutralidade climática em 2050, colocada pelo Brasil, ela é uma meta que inclui não apenas CO2, mas todos os gases de efeito estufa. Isso faz uma diferença muito grande. Por quê? Porque hoje a gente tem, desculpa, saiu um pouco de formatação aqui, mas cerca de 30% a 40% das emissões brasileiras hoje são de metano e óxido nitroso N2O, ou seja, não são CO2. Então, para o Brasil, faz muita diferença uma meta de neutralidade em carbono e uma meta de neutralidade em gases de efeito estufa, na medida em que 1/3, mais ou menos, das emissões são gases não CO2. E qual é o problema? Esses gases não CO2, eles são de difícil abatimento. Quando a gente fala do metano, por exemplo, da fermentação entérica do gado, há várias possibilidades tecnológicas de reduzir essas emissões de metano, mas infelizmente zerá-las não é tecnicamente viável. E é parecido também com o N2O, o óxido nitroso da agricultura, do uso de fertilizantes nitrogenados. Então, o que significa? Significa que a gente vai chegar em 2050 com emissões residuais bastante relevantes para o Brasil. Não apenas o metano e o N2O que eu já mencionei, mas também emissões de CO2 de setores de difícil abatimento, como cimento, siderurgia e outros. Então, diante desse perfil de emissões, a meta brasileira de emissões líquidas nulas de gases de efeito estufa é bastante ambiciosa e ela implica em algumas transformações bastante profundas. Tá? E como o Roberto também já mencionou, chegar em 2050 com emissões nulas de gases de efeito estufa significa chegar a emissões nulas de CO2 10 anos antes. Por quê? Porque a gente vai precisar chegar em 2050 com emissões negativas para poder compensar as emissões residuais do Brasil. E o que tem de resultado em relação a isso? Eu vou mostrar esse aqui é a única figura que eu mostrei de resultados, mas de certa forma ela passa toda a mensagem que a gente quer passar. No Brasil, a gente tem hoje o setor de maior emissões é o setor de florestas, basicamente o desmatamento. Se a gente quiser alcançar as emissões líquidas nulas de gases de efeito estufa em 2050, necessariamente o maior emissor do Brasil vai precisar se transformar em o maior sumidouro de CO2. Isso implica em, interromper o desmatamento, tanto o desmatamento legal quanto o desmatamento ilegal. 2, restauração florestal em escalas que não foram precedentes ainda no país. Talvez na China, sim, mas no Brasil ainda não. Além disso, as emissões, então isso implica emissões negativas do uso do solo para compensar emissões positivas. Setor de agricultura, a Gisele apresentou várias opções interessantes de sistemas agropecuários, de integrados, recuperação de pastagens, de carbon farming, que faz com que você consiga armazenar carbono no solo. Tá? Também são muito importantes para poder trazer emissões negativas para o Brasil. Terceiro, emissões negativas a partir do uso de biocombustíveis acoplados à captura e armazenamento geológico de CO2. É talvez uma das grandes vantagens comparativas energéticas do Brasil, o uso de biocombustíveis, e a grande vantagem do biocombustível é que, diante da possibilidade de você armazenar o carbono do biocombustível, você consegue obter emissões negativas. Então, é importante ressaltar novamente o papel desses modelos de escopo nacional, que quando você coloca uma meta brasileira rodada por, digamos, modelos que não conhecem a realidade brasileira, eles podem perder esse tipo de nuance que não percebe de fato as especificidades, os problemas e as potencialidades nacionais. De forma geral, eu queria só trazer então esse breve exemplo, acho que meu tempo já acabou, vou ser bem pontual, na mosca, 10 minutos. Eu tenho esses resultados eles são muito amplos, a gente tem resultados para transportes, indústria, energia, uso do solo, agricultura, florestas, etc. Mas infelizmente em 10 minutos não há tempo de detalhar todos os resultados, então eu termino aqui com uma mensagem final, se me permite mais um minutinho. Quando a gente fala em transições energéticas ou transições para baixo carbono ou transições verdes ou economia verde, ou chame do nome que quiser, há vários. Todo mundo pensa que há um custo, todo mundo pensa que há barreiras para essa transição e que ela é muito cara. O importante é entender que, na verdade, cara é não fazer nada. Tá? Só nas recentes enchentes do Rio Grande do Sul, em termos puramente de orçamento público, tá? Não estou falando da pessoa que perdeu a geladeira, perdeu a casa, perdeu todos os seus bens e serviços e teve que comprar tudo de novo, não estou falando do dano total, estou falando apenas do que foi gasto de orçamento público, foram 70 bilhões. Aí a Spácia comentou que tem um fundo de economia verde de $1 bilhão. Não é nada perto do dano que as mudanças climáticas vão causar, caso eventos como o Rio Grande do Sul, por exemplo, se tornem mais intensos e mais frequentes. Imagina gastar 70 bilhões de orçamento público a cada 5 anos. Né? Quanto de energia renovável, quanto de agricultura sustentável a gente não consegue fazer com 70 bilhões. Tá? Então, com isso eu encerro minha apresentação e agradeço mais uma vez a oportunidade de falar com vocês.
Muito obrigado, professor André. Agradeço por seguir aqui o horário da mesa. Vamos passar agora para o Luiz Silva, doutor Luiz Silva.
Good morning, my name is Luiz Silva. I'm representing the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and RUC it stands for Renmin University of China. And this presentation draws on institutional theory and state capacity approaches to examine how local governments mediate national energy transition goals. It was based on fieldwork in Beijing, Shanghai, and Xiantao, a medium-sized city in China. I explore how political incentives, administrative capacity, and special constraints shape energy outcomes, bringing comparative insights for the Global South. In this research, I addressed two main questions. First, how do local institutional capacities shape the implementation of China's national energy transition policies? And second, what lessons, if any, can be drawn for other Global South contexts, such as Brazil, for example? And while exploring these questions, I realized that although China is often framed as a transition leader, the reality on the ground is far more uneven. The empirical findings show that despite major technological and institutional advances, China's rapid growth in renewables, innovation, and experimentation is embedded in a unique governance model, a model that combines top-level strategic planning with fragmented implementation, adaptive local capacities, and strong political signaling. So rather than asking what China has done to succeed, a question that assumes the existence of simple or transferable lessons, I reframed the puzzle through an interpretive and empirically grounded lens. So the question I put is, how has this outcome been constructed, contested, and unevenly institutionalized across urban spaces? This, I believe, opens up a broader comparative reflection. Why has China advanced so rapidly in clean energy deployment while many other Global South countries continue to face up deep structural, institutional, and political barriers. So, given China's broader institutional context, my analytical approach builds on a multi-level institutional framework. I try to integrate concepts of state capacity, decentralized governance, and social technical systems. These lenses allow me to examine how transitions are implemented and experienced locally, focusing on how national energy policies are translated into everyday urban realities. This means looking closely at the role of local authorities, fragmented authority structures, and social material configurations in shaping the outcomes of energy policy. I adopt a problem-oriented perspective guided by the research questions mentioned earlier. The goal is to uncover how social technical transitions are constructed, negotiated, contested, and especially differentiated across China's diverse urban contexts. My analysis centers on the institutional, political, and social technical processes that shape urban energy transitions under conditions of governance fragmentation. The central argument is that China's urban transition is not a coherent top-down process. Instead, it reflects a fragmented and negotiated dynamic, one embedded in uneven local capacities and institutional configurations. This institutional fragmentation is the result of decades of political and administrative reforms that redefine the state market relations in China especially. What emerges is a hybrid configuration, part central coordination and part municipal autonomy, in part experimentalism. So in contrast to narratives portraying certain countries as energy transition pioneers, I argue that China represents a state-led experimentalist system where transitions are shaped by endogenous constraints and persistent social spatial unevenness. This research is not based on desk work. It relies on qualitative methods with participant observation as the core strategy. Fieldwork was conducted between September 2023 and January 2024 in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shantou, focusing on how energy transitions take shape in everyday urban life. So rather than just analyzing documents or conducting structured interviews, I engaged directly with public spaces, infrastructures, informal interactions, capturing how policies and technologies intersect with social practices. In Beijing, observations focus on residential areas, university campuses, subway systems, and eco-districts. Particular attention was paid to Renmin University, where I stayed, where rooftop solar panels, EV chargers, heating systems, and surveillance technologies were documented. In Shanghai, the field extended into semi-urban zones where solar adoption revealed the rise of small grid infrastructures. In contrast, Shantou showed persistent reliance on fossil fuel appliances, highlighting how transitions remain uneven across urban contexts. I applied an interpretive methodology inspired by Geertz's thick description, prioritizing contextual meaning over quantification. So field notes, photos, and informal interviews were categorized thematically and triangulated with policy documents from energy experts' documents and local planning reports. Finally, my position as a foreign researcher shaped access and my insights. So while institutional entry was limited in Beijing, everyday observations in public spaces helped me uncover dynamics often absent from official discourse. So, about the empirical findings. Yes. The empirical findings are structured around three key dimensions: infrastructure visibility and access, municipal governance practices, and social technical discontinuities. To understand urban energy transitions in China, we must consider the institutional architecture shaped over the past 2 decades, particularly under the 13th Five-Year Plan, which promoted distributed generation, technological diversification, and adaptive regulation. These national policies provided a foundation, but they materialize differently depending on urban capacity, political signaling, and spatial hierarchy. In Beijing, energy transition serves a symbolic and political function. The city features eco-districts, smart grids, and green buildings, often concentrated in high-profile zones with controlled access. In Shanghai, technologies like EV chargers and solar lighting are highly visible, but not evenly integrated across the city. This reflects what can be called symbolic infrastructure, technologies that signal modernization even if unevenly used. Institutionally, Beijing demonstrates a strong financial and planning capacity, but prioritizes select areas, leaving others marginal to experimentation. In Shanghai, the transition is framed as a space for entrepreneurial innovation. Public-private partnerships, pilot projects, and smart mobility systems were observed, including battery swapping stations and green building management platforms. Here, the state acts as a broker, mediating between policy goals and private investment. But special disparities remain, especially in peripheral districts, where access to this innovation is limited or delayed. Shantou, by contrast, illustrates a reality of scarcity and improvisation. Infrastructure is basic, fossil fuel dominant, and often is unstable. Solar adoption is informal, driven by subsidies or households coping strategies. Fieldwork showed low state presence, limited technical capacity, and no active pilot programs in effect, despite national discourse in Shantou. Still, bottom-up adaptation emerged. Residents combined wood stoves, electric heaters, and informal repairs to meet their daily needs. Taken together, these cases show China's energy transition is not a linear success history, but a differentiated, contested, and especially uneven process. It's shaped by urban capacity, institutional configuration, and local improvisation. When it comes to China and Brazil comparison, to close this comparative session, I contrast China's urban cases with two subnational experiences in Brazil, Minas Gerais and São Paulo. What emerges is that neither the public-led model of Minas Gerais nor the private-led model of São Paulo has produced sociable or consistent results in advancing the energy transition. In China, megacities benefit from high state capacity, while smaller cities face structural limitations. In Brazil, Minas Gerais operates under a state-led public framework, but suffers from bureaucratic inertia and technical gaps. São Paulo relies heavily on the private sector, but lacks effective coordination, resulting in fragmented governance. Policy interpretation in China is adaptive, within constraints. In Brazil, energy policies often reflect political volatility and institutional incoherence. China's urban cores are advanced, while Brazilian infrastructure lags outside major hubs. China's municipal autonomy is subordinated to central strategy. Brazil's autonomy is high on paper, but underfunded. And to conclude, private sector roles diverge. China is emergent and politically embedded. São Paulo is overactive and disjointed, while Minas Gerais remains passive. In both countries, municipal governments matter, but their ability to act depends on institutional incentives. resource flows and alignment between national and local priorities. In China, fragmentation is strategically managed. In Brazil, it's structural, but it's politically unstable. In conclusion, this research highlights that energy transitions are not uniform, even within a state often portrayed as centralized and coherent like China. Fieldwork in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shantou shows how national policies are interpreted, adapted, or sidestepped, depending on local capacity, political incentives, and special context. Beijing exemplifies strategic visibility, Shanghai promotes selective innovation, Shantou reveals fragility and improvisation. What ties them together is not coherence, but socio-technical fragmentation, shaped by uneven institutional power and local governance. So this challenges the idea of China as a monolithic model. And to conclude, ultimately, China's case is not a model to copy, but a lens to rethink transition as a contested reconfiguration of infrastructure, power, in everyday life, even though it's successful. Thank you. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Luiz. Vamos para a apresentação do professor Dong Jiang, da Nanjing Universidade de Silvicultura da China.
大家上午好，非常荣幸有这个机会来这里跟大家交流，感谢这个会议的组织方，感谢刘金龙教授给的机会。然后，我汇报的题目是，我应该留下还是离开？在环境这个生态系统服务项目中，农民在政策设计发生变化时候去留的选择。跟大家前面做的研究可能不太一样，我这一个更微观一点。那么这个研究呢，它有一个背景如下，就是因为生态系统服务，这个生态系统服务支付是这个其实是一个大家都众所周知的这样一个情况，它主要是基于一个自愿的一个交易，然后买方负责这个提供资金，那么卖方呢负责这个提供生态系统服务，然后这个 PS 项目呢，实际上在世界上已经进行了广泛的实施，那么也它在实现这样一个阻止这个森林退化，然后提供这个生态系统服务。然后这个还有这样一个生物多样性的这样一个保护方面，已经发挥了这个广泛的作用。那么同时呢，在一些生态系统服务项目，因为它不同的生态系统服务项目，它有不同的目标。那么一些生态系统服务项目，它其实也面临着一些挑战，特别是在这样一个生物多样性的保护方面。特别是当这样一个生态系统服务项目，它主要是通过种植这样一个单一的纯林的方式来实现的时候，那么呢？我们知道，就是如果要实现一个生物多样性的这样一个保护，那么对于这样一个混交林，还有一个差异化的结构组成，它是非常重要的。那么，对于中国的这个退耕还林项目来说呢，我们知道它是这个世界上最大的一个林业工程项目。那么，中国的这样一个森林面积已经实现了这样一个在全世界森林面积都一个净损失的情况下面，中国的森林面积已经实现了40多年的这样一个净增长。那么其中一个非常非常重要的贡献就是中国实施了退耕还林项目。那么中国的退耕还林项目呢，是从1999年开始实施，当时是基于中国一个大洪水的这样一个背景，然后认识到这样一个在这个坡度的这样一个土地上面进行耕作，不利于这样一个生态环境的维护，所以就实施了这样一个在这样一个坡度的这样一个土地上。当有耕作的情况下面呢，就实施了一个退耕这样一个项目。那么这个项目呢，实施了2轮，第一轮呢是1999年开始实施的，第二轮呢是2004年开始实施的。那么它的退耕还林的面积，包括在坡度基本上是大于25度的这样一个土地上进行，如果有进行耕作，那么就进行退耕，然后还林，还有包括这样一个在荒山地上进行造林这样一种情况下面，总共的退耕还林的面积已经达到了这样一个3400多万亩，然后呢，投入的资金达到了这个844.8这样一个亿美元的这样一个规模。那么所以这是其实是一个非常非常大的一个贡献，特别是对中国的这个森林面积的增长。 那么当然，这样一个项目的过程中，当时它主要是基于这样一个中国的大洪水的背景，所以它实施这个项目的主要的目的是为了防止这样一个水土的流失。所以基于这样一个功能，我们实施了这样一个退耕还林项目。但是另外一个层面呢，随着这个项目的实施，我们发现就是说它里面也有一些它的不足。就是一个比较重要的一个情况，就是我们的退耕还林项目里面85%的这样一个种植的这样一个林木是属于这种纯林。那么有没有可能在这样一个基础之上进行一些改善和提升？就是我们已经实施了这样一个项目，那么如果我们进行一个政策设计的一个变化，特别是通过由纯林到混交林，然后在改善生态系统服务方面发挥作用的这样一种政策背景情况下面，那么农民他的意愿是怎样的？他是愿意选择留下来，还是会选择离开？所以这就是我们这个研究项目里面。跟已有研究的这样一个不同的地方，也是我们希望去填补的一个已有研究的一个不足。围绕这样一个情况，我们的研究目标就是希望去提供一个实证的这样一个证明，来证明当一个政策设计发生变化的时候，这个政策参与者他们的一个选择是怎样的，特别是从这个纯林到混交林的这样一种变化，然后去检验农民的偏好对项目的这种偏好的特性和影响他们选择的这样一个因素是什么。我们的研究区域位于中国的这样一个贵州省，贵州省是全球25个生物多样性的这样一个热点区域。然后呢，其中选择的这个市级的这个层面是它的毕节市，毕节市是第2轮，也就是2014年开始实施退耕还林的这样一个这个地级市中面积最大的这样一个地级市。然后我们从中选择了这个2个这个县3个村，然后150个农户的这样一个调研。那么在做这个设计的时候，我们是开始了2轮的这个调研。第1轮是一个就是关键人物的访谈，这个实施是2023年的4月到5月份实施的。那么第2轮的话呢，我们开始就是到2023年的7月和8月，我们实施了这样一个农户的调研。我们采取了这个就是在处理这个数据的时候，我们主要采取了这种混合逻辑的模型的这种方法。它可以输出这个连续的参数，然后它可以实现这种潜在的这样一个分类，然后它也可以估计它这样一个能够接受的这样一个支付意愿。那么基于我们的这样一个就是我们的一个关键人物的访谈，然后呢，我们对于这样一个项目政策设计，它要考虑哪些因素呢？我们归纳出来了4个因素。第一个就是这个合约，这个合约的长度。它有5年、10年、15年。第2个就是树种，它包括混合树种的方式，它包括这种经纪人的混合比如说李树和这个樱桃等等这样一种，还包括这种经纪林和这种用材林的这样一个或者说生态林的一个混合。比如说我们种植一部分种植沙木，那么一部分种植李子。那么呢，第3个就是这种经济激励就是它分别是300元每亩、400元每亩和500元每亩。那么这个1公顷呢，它是15亩。然后第4个就是它技术支持，一个是没有技术支持，然后是这个有一个比较简单的技术支持，还有一个就是一个比较系统的这样一个技术培训。这样一个4个属性情况下面呢，我们运用我们的这个 R 模型，然后通过这种标准这个效率标准的这样一个检验，设计出了这种8种选择集。然后这是呢这是其中的一个选择集，每一个选择集它就包括我们刚才说的这样4个属性。然后每一个选择集它包括3个选择，前面第1个、第2个都是不同的你愿意留下来的方式，第3个所有的选择集里面这8个都是一样的，就是第3个是他离开的选择。那么这就是我们的一个研究设计，所以它是一个实验的方式，通过一个实验的方式，然后150个农户，每个农户他可以做8个选择，所以实际上呢，我们的样本规模是达到1200。那么在这样一个情况下面，我们就通过一个实证研究的方式，我们得到了一个结果，发现虽然说我们在实施第2轮退耕还林的农户，他们主要采取的是这种种植单一纯林的方式，但是当我们提供这种政策设计的这种新的选择的时候，这个农户里面，他大多数他们是愿意选择继续参与这样一个新的项目设计，也就是我们说的这个混交林的这样一个项目设计。然后我们同时也会发现，这个农户的他这个偏好它是具有差异的，是有异质性的。这个里面我们就发现有一个很重要的这样一个合约的一个属性，就是它的长度。我们说的5年、10年和15年，它其实并不显著。然后我们通过刚才我们知道，我们每一个选择集它其实有3个类型，一个是有设计了3个，每一个选择集它有一个3个情景。然后呢， 第3个情景是他选择离开。那么然后我们进行这个分类回归的时候，我们会发现选择离开的这样一个农户，他们主要是耕地面积比较小的农户，然后呢，他家庭规模比较大，然后收入比较低，并且呢，在收入比较低的收入里面，他比较有高的这样一个非农收入这样一个情况。然后我们发现，他们如果要想他们留下来，他们的意愿是多少呢？因为他们偏向于离开这样一个项目选择，就是选择离开。如果要求他们要留下来的话，他们的要求的这样一个补偿意愿是比较高的。那么我们当然还有这个选择留下来的这个类型里面，选择留下来这个类型里面，我们有2类啊。第一类可能就是第一类，我们发现是年轻人男性，就是家庭户主为男性，还有认为在这个退耕还领里面获得比较大的这样一个经济收益的这一个群体，他们更希望会选择这种这个就是经济的混交的这个树种，然后他们会收到一个就中等层面的这样一个技术支持。那么还有一种类型的话，那么他们的要求的补偿是比较低的。还有一种类型就是还有一种类型是偏向这种混合的生态经济的这样一个情况，他们的要求的补偿也是比较低的。那么从这个几个结果里面简单的汇报里面，我们会发现，它就是在政策层面，我们有几个启示。第一个就是我们认为这种生态系统服务项目里面，特别是涉及到林业的时候，我们要从这样一个单一的纯林要转向这样一个混合林，然后从强调它的面积，要强调它的这样一个生物多样性。第二个就是我们讲因为不同的农户他有不同的这样一个偏好，他在乎的这样一个合约的属性是不一样，所以这个时候需要我们进行一个量身定做，而不是一个一刀切的单一化的这样一个政策设计。第3个就是因为不同的农户他参与这样一个就是混交林的这样一个项目，他的偏好他的补偿意愿是不一样的，所以这个里面就需要我们根据这样一个发挥它的额外效应的时候，就需要我们进行一个差异化的一个补偿设计，从而使得它可以这个补偿的这样一个资金可以发挥更好的效果。那么我们中国的这一种情况，实际上我们讲就是对于当前比如说在巴西的这样一个这个大西洋的这种项目，包括在这个包括在这个越南啊等等这些国家，还包括在哥斯达黎加等的这些国家，其实他们都有实行这样一个 PS 项目。其实我们也可以为大家提供一个参考。以上就是我的汇报，谢谢。
Muito obrigado pela apresentação. Vamos para a última, com o professor Lucas Figueroa, da Universidade Nacional de San Martín, da Argentina.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this conference. My name is Lucas Figueroa. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the National University of San Martín. And my presentation is titled States Initiatives to Promote Sustainable Production in Forest Ecosystem. The organization of my presentation is, first I will talk about the importance of forests in our country and the main instrument that tries to regulate them, that is the National Forest Law. Then I will talk about the main instrument of this law, that is the National Forest Fund, that is a PES scheme and its application, and another key instrument of this law that is a Forest Management Control and Verification System that is called SACBEFOR in Spanish. Then I focus on the evolution of deforestation and the main driver with the aim to analyze the effect of the implementation of this law in our territory. And finally, I will talk about the international recognition and the access to REDD+, and the future steps to promote sustainable management and conservation in forests and possible line of collaboration. Argentina is home to 7 different forest regions. Each one has a unique biodiversity and key local stakeholders. This is important because Argentina is a federal country, where in this case provinces have the autonomy to regulate natural resources, among them the forest. However, they must comply the national environmental law. Considered its forest region between 2000 and 2015, Argentina ranked among the top 10 countries with the highest deforestation, according to a report of the FAO in 2016. The main driver of deforestation is the uncontrolled expansion of the agricultural frontier. However, in the last 5 days, the forest fires are emerging as a growing threat, so we need to take into account that to analyze the drivers of deforestation. The Argentina Gran Chaco, that is the bigger green area in this map, or Parque Chaqueño, is the largest forest region and is the most critical area because it accounts for nearly the 80% of total national deforestation. Considering the relevance of our forest, the National Congress passed in 2007 the National Forest Law, with the aim to promote forest conservation and sustainable management through a Provincial Territorial Plannings Law, OTBN in Spanish. The OTBN must classify forests based on different conservation values in 3 categories. The red category is related to the high value of conservation, where only is possible to apply conservation activity like ecotourism, research activity, process of regeneration, and in this case, obviously, the land use change is not allowed. The same thing is occurred in the yellow category, what is the medium value of conservation. In this case, it's possible to apply, for example, sustainable activities, different activities, like, for example, selective logging, silvopastoral practices, and in this case, again, deforestation or land use change is not allowed. However, in green category, that is the low value of conservation, land use change is possible following different national criteria. And to achieve the provincial application, National Forest Law established the main instrument that is a PES scheme, that is the National Forest Fund. In this case, national states distribute an annual payment to public and private owners to impulse forest protection. It is financed through the 0.3% of the total national budget, with the aim to support 2 types of projects. Conservation projects that can be applied in red, yellow, and green category, with the aim to maintain or increase the forest cover, and sustainable management projects that is possible to apply in yellow and green category, with the aim to maintain forest cover through different sustainable activities. Related with the advances of the implementation of the Native Forest Law, in Argentina we have 23 provinces with native forests, and it's important to note that all provinces pass their territorial plannings law, mapping their forests into the 3 categories of conservation. In total, we have 53 million hectares of native forest, and in this map we can see how was the decision to locate their forest. And considering the autonomy of the provinces, we can see many differences in the decision of locate their forest. For example, in considering the Chaco region, we can see, for example, differences among the province of Formosa, that is partially total green, and Santiago del Estero, that is other important provinces with much forest, that is more yellow. So the aim is to impulse sustainable management practices according to the activities in the National Forest Law. Regarding the evolution of the implementation of National Forest Fund, in the first graph we can see the evolution of the land covered by project. In this case, almost 5 million hectares are covered by project in 2022. This is approximately the 10% of total lands that are covered by this project. This percentage can be low, but if we consider that more than the 80% of total projects were financed by private owner, this can show us, among other things, the consensus regarding in private actors regarding the National Forest Law, the National Forest Fund on one hand, and in the other hand, related to the instrument of the National Forest Law. So for us, this is important. In this map, we can see the location of conservation and sustainable management project in the different provinces. Black point in this case is the conservation project, and blue point is the sustainable management project. Again, this map shows us, among other things, how provincial autonomy allows variation in the decision of provinces to locate the different plants. For example, again, we can see differences between Córdoba, that had many conservation projects, but Chaco, for example, that is another key provinces for us, has more sustainable management projects. So again, provincial autonomy is a key variable to analyze the implementation of this law. SAC-B4 is the other key instrument that this law has, that is called Forest Management Control and Verification System. This is a national platform to monitor and control the extraction, transport, and trade of native forests. It operates in real time, so we can follow the implement of this instrument, and this is important because it's integrated with the provincial system. Taking into account the provincial's vision, the provincial interest is important to the implementation of this law, considering the competencies that provinces has in our country. This is a key tool to strengthen forest governance and in relationship with the National Forest Law to promote sustainable management of native forests in the different provinces. In this graph, we can see the effect of the implementation of this law. And for example, in the first graph, we can see how the deforestation was decreased in this period from 2007 to 2023. We can see how the deforestation is decreased, but we can see as well different peaks in this evolution. For example, in 2020 or in 2022 or in 2018, we can see different peaks, but these peaks are explained but for a fire that, as I said before, that this is an emerging problem for us. But if we consider 2014 to 2023, taking out the forest fire, we can see that the deforestation is quite similar in the period. The same occurs with the evolution of emission for deforestation since the implementation of the National Forest Law. So we can see an important effect of the implementation of this law in our country. Considering that, Argentina submit a request with FAO to access to REDD+ based on its emission reduction results. In 2019, we accessed to REDD+ with a disbursement of $82 million. And the base to implement this scheme is to apply the activities that were used in the implementation of the National Forest Fund. So we have an important basis with the implementation of this PES scheme. Some activities are, that I said, some silvopastoral practices, like, for example, integrated livestock and forest management. Strengthening a project led by indigenous community, this is an important actor in our territory. Then intensify forest fire reduction. And finally, to impulse the traceability system of timber products. This is my last slide. I put 4 lines that Argentina we need to impulse to promote sustainable management in forest ecosystem. The first one is the need to scale up existing mechanisms. In this case, REDD+ offers a concrete opportunity to deepen and expand the current achievement in deforestation and emission reduction. Then the scientific community, and I think that this could be an important collaboration considering other presentations, we need to conduct more systematical studies, for example, in the implementation of the National Forest Fund and the REDD+. And I think that we can conduct 2 different studies. One, a quantitative studies to evaluate the implementation and the effect of the National Forest Law, the National Forest Fund and the REDD+, in comparison with other key variables, social variables, economical variables, political variables. And then this could show us, for example, among other things, the importance of the effect of this scheme. But another important study that we can conduct is qualitative analysis, to analyze, to illustrate how Argentina, its provinces, the actors in the provinces, and private actors, and civil society, and considering the heterogeneity of the civil society in our country, are responding or evaluating these instruments. So I think that qualitative studies are really important to understand how National Forest Law is implementing. And then this is important as well to strengthen multi-level governance. That I think that this is really important considering our federal country, because we need to improve coordination among national, private authorities, civil society, and the private sectors. And in this case, we play a key role because we are a knowledge broker. We know the actors, we know the territory, so we need a weekend to strengthen this multi-level governance in our country. And finally, I think that Argentina, considering my presentation and considering that all provinces with native forests complete their land use zoning and began implementing these mechanisms, is a valuable case to analyze and to take in account for other countries in our region. So thank you so much for inviting me, and if you have any question.
Muito obrigado, Lucas. Então, eu agradeço aqui à mesa por terem sido breves, né? A gente conseguiu aqui correr atrás do atraso e ter um momento, um espaço para 2 perguntas, um espaço de interação aqui com o pessoal. e na sequência a gente convida a todos para almoçar conosco. Vamos começar, temos 2, né? Então, começando, vou pedir para que venham aqui na frente, para que o pessoal que está assistindo virtualmente também veja vocês. Por favor. Puder falar o nome, a instituição e para quem está endereçando a pergunta.
Alexandre Avignon, da UFRJ e do IBAMA. A pergunta é para quem fez a explanação sobre floresta. Nós, do Brasil, temos um outro mecanismo, que são as concessões florestais. Essas concessões florestais são usadas na Argentina ou na China. Na realidade, você preserva a floresta em pé através de um uso com manejo. O que não foi comentado, também eu gostaria de conhecer na China e na Argentina, nós temos um outro instrumento muito forte, que é a unidade de conservação, que permite que você detenha o desmatamento. E quais seriam, aí uma terceira possibilidade, quais seriam os instrumentos que vocês têm para recuperação? Acho que a China ficou bem claro que ela tem um instrumento com um fundo específico para recuperação florestal daquela que já foi retirada. Mas é uma questão de land use, né? Ou seja, modificação do uso da terra. Como é que vocês veem isso?
Vamos para a segunda pergunta, aí a gente passa aqui para
boa tarde, meu nome é Tadeu, sou pesquisador aqui do INCT. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta para a professora Cheng. E, assim, a China é um grande exemplo de planejamento de longo prazo e de articulação com as suas estatais. Aqui no Brasil, 4 empresas chinesas foram fundamentais para o desenvolvimento do nosso setor elétrico desde 2010. A State Grid, a SPIC, a China Três Gargantas e a Nuclear. Então, na infraestrutura, as chinesas ajudaram o maior investimento hoje no Brasil, 18 bilhões, que é a linha Norte-Sul, da State Grid. E eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho como que a experiência chinesa de universalização do acesso à energia em comunidades rurais, em comunidades assim, de baixa renda, para a gente discutir um pouquinho essa questão de justiça, transição energética, inclusão, desenvolvimento inclusivo.
Yes. Thank you for your question. Considering our instrument, I think that one that I didn't talk in my presentation could be the relationship between some finance project financed by the state, national states, to indigenous communities. I think that indigenous communities in our country are important in the territory where forests are nowadays. So I think that this is another key instrument that, for example, was financed by the World Bank. That this was one that called, I don't remember the name, but was applied in different provinces like Santiago del Estero, Chaco, Formosa, that are important in our country. But we need, again, I think that the main problem with our country is that we need to scale up the mechanisms, because I think that is a low part of our territory, so we need more finance, and in this case where our national states are disfinanced this program, so we need to scale up with international cooperation to improve this scheme. I think that the WIS scheme are important to strengthen the forest governance. So I think that in relation with indigenous communities could be another way that we need to finance and to improve. Yes.
谢谢你的提问你的提问其实让我想到了我们中国这个公共产品和服务的一个均等化。我们经常讲，在很多的领域减少数字鸿沟将电力送到千家万户道路修到千家万户，还有我们的水，这些基本的公共产品和服务，是政府的一个非常重要的职能。其实说到根本上，可能是我们中国的这个社会主义的制度，它本质上有这样的一个要求，作为一个政治任务。第二点我想说的是什么呢？就是中国的就是刚才谈到的国有企业。其实国有企业呢，在中国呢，它是非常有争议的。很多经济学家认为国有企业应该全部的，就是效率很低下，应该私有化进行改造。 但是在中国，我看到另外一个场景，那是中国的国有企业，它承担了很多的社会责任和环境责任，它做很多事情，它将电送到乡村，送到边远地带的人，将这个网络信号送到千家万户，其实它的经济成本是非常高的。如果是按照市场的原则，这个是不划算的，是不好做的。从一些实地调研的情况来看呢，中国政府它确立了一个，这个是一个公共的利益，它不是纯粹的一个市场的问题。我们的社会主义制度也要求我们需要做到这些，那它还是有经济的问题，对不对？它还是要花钱，不可能不花钱是很难做到的。中国在这个制度方面还有一个，我从实地调研和访谈，国有企业它往往是什么？它可能在其他的地方，在富有的地带，它可能通过它的一些市场化的业务，它挣到了一些利润，但是它会将这个利润转移到其他的一些不挣钱的领域，他们往往是这样一种混合的经济体。其实我现在也比较喜欢这样一个混合经济的概念。其实在中国，它的国有企业，你说它纯粹是一个企业吗？它也不是，它其实有社会的公共价值的目标。所以这个也是我认为需要突破的一个理论的概念，就是说我们做这样一件事情，它是一个公共的事情，但同时在做这件事情，我们也不是说不计成本的，不在乎它的经济效益的，我们也在乎经济效益，但同时我们要做的这个是基本的一个人权嘛 ，human right， 这个好，这是我的回答，谢谢。
Então, pessoal, a gente agradece a presença de vocês aqui nessa parte da manhã. Convidamos a todos para um almoço.